Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Hemoglobin A1c, Standardization, Analytical Performance, and Interference of HB Variants. I'm Susie Valdez of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Abbott Diagnostics. To learn more, visit them at www.abbott.com. So let's get started. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing this presentation, just click on that support tab found at the right of your presentation window or report the problem by clicking on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. Now, this presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credit tab located at the top right of your presentation window and follow the process to obtain those credits. I now present today's speaker, Dr. Erna Lenters-Westra, an HbA1c research technician at Isla Clinical Chemistry Department in Zwolle in the Netherlands. For a complete biography of our speaker, please visit the Biography tab at the top of your screen. Dr. Lenters-Westra, you may now begin your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Welcome to you all over the world, maybe in the morning or in the afternoon or maybe even in the evening. I'm very happy to give this webinar. Well, to be honest, not really happy. I would have preferred to give this presentation live to you because I really miss the interaction with you all. But this is the best we can do right now, and I hope I can make this presentation as interesting as possible for you. And if you are a little bit bored, just look at the beautiful pictures I have from our hospital in my presentation. Did you know that there are right now 425 million people with diabetes? And that 1 in 2 remains undiagnosed? Maybe HbA1c can help us to find these people with diabetes so that we can treat them. But before we do that, we need to standardize HbA1c. And that is the main topic of my presentation today. The content of the presentation, I will talk a little bit about HbA1c in general. I will talk about the NGSP harmonization, the IFCC standardization, different HbA1c methodologies, and interference of HB variants, and I will show you the results of some external quality schemes. Well, you probably all know that HbA1c is an independent parameter of the metabolic control. It is also a risk parameter for the development of complications, which has been established in 2 big studies, the DST study and the follow-up study, the UKPDS study. I will talk about it a little bit later. From these 2 big studies, we have now the treatment goal in the disease management. Like if you keep your HbA1c below 7%, or below 53 millimole per mole, the chance that you will develop complication is quite small. But it's also an independent cardiovascular risk parameter in non-diabetics. For example, in our hospital, every patient who is admitted to the hospital with a heart attack or a suspicion of a heart attack, we also measure HbA1c. And if HbA1c is at the low end of the reference range, the mortality and the morbidity is much lower than when you have your HbA1c at the high end of the reference range. In the Netherlands, it's also used to assess the quality of diabetes care by quality assurance programs. Like the general physician, if the mean of all his patients is below 7% or below 53 millimole per mole, he gets more money. And it's now also used as a parameter for the diagnosis of diabetes. Not in every country. For example, in my country, it is not used yet, officially, but of course we all know that unofficially it has been used already for many, many years. But what about if you measure your HbA1c at the end of May? What is then the total influence on monthly blood glucose on HbA1c? Well, as you can see here that if something happens in the last 2 weeks before you measure your HbA1c, when you are not that stable, it will have a big impact on your HbA1c value. But if you were not very stable in February or March, the influence on HbA1c is not that high. So this is something you have to take into account when you interpret the HbA1c results. Let's talk a little bit about HbA1c. Well, the first HbA1c method was commercially available in 1978, but it took 10 years before the American Diabetes Association recommends routine monitoring. We have currently more than 100 HbA1c methods and platforms available, or maybe even more because also point-of-care instruments are increasing considerably in the market. And there are more than 20 international manufacturers, but also many more national. Like in China, they have many national manufacturers. And there are different international and national standards. The 5 different method principles are cation exchange chromatography HPLC, boronate affinity chromatography, capillary electrophoresis, immunoassay, and enzymatic methods. Before 2003, there was no reference material available, which you can see in this graph from Randy Little. This is the results of a colleague of American Pathology Survey, an external quality survey. In 1993, they sent a sample, and you see that some labs are reporting a result of 2.5, and others are reporting 7.5. So the inter-lab CV was more than 20%. Due to the standardization, the NGSP and IFCC standardization, we have now an inter-lab CV of approximately 3.5%, which is really, really good. Well, why is it then so important to have this standardization? Of course, we want to have all the results together, but we also want to use uniform clinical guidelines. And we need this standardization to use uniform reference values, but also to compare scientific studies with each other. So all the results, all the lab methods all over the world, it doesn't matter which method it is, they should give the same result. Let's talk a little bit about the American standardization, which is based on the DST study. This study was about 1,441 patients with type 1 diabetes. They were divided in 2 groups. One got a conventional care, so not that very strict, and the other group got very intensive treatment with the goal to get the glucose values as low as possible and have a low HbA1c value. And there was a determination of the long-term complication in both groups. All the samples were measured in one single core lab using one method, which is the HPLC method. This is why we are many times people call HPLC the gold standard. Because at that time it was a gold standard because this HPLC was used in that very, very important study. But it's not the gold standard anymore because the routine methods have improved considerably and they are performing now, well, even better than this HPLC. The UKPDS also measured HbA1c and values were also directly comparable to the DST study. Well, this is a very famous graph you're all familiar with, I assume, that if the HbA1c is increasing, you also increase the relative risk of developing complications. That is such a difficult word to pronounce. Retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, and microalbuminuria. So you have to keep your HbA1c as low as possible. Also, if you decrease your HbA1c with 1% or 11 millimole per mole, we will have 21% less deaths related to diabetes, or 37% less microvascular complications, or 40% less myocardial infarction. So it's very important. So these studies have been very important. This is how the NGSP, the American Standardization, is organized. In the middle, you see the Central Primary Reference Lab. They are still running the HPLC, the same HPLC as being used in the DC study. Then you have the Secondary Reference Lab. They are running routine methods. Here you have all the secondary reference labs with their secondary reference method. Like in Randy Little labs, he has a boronate affinity HPLC and an ion exchange HPLC, a TOZO and a Premier, and another TOZO G8 in America, and Bio-Rad variant 2 in China, and a KO500 HPLC in Japan. And this is the European Reference Laboratory. This is my lab, and together with another lab in the Netherlands, we are the European Reference Laboratory. In the other lab from Cas Wijkamp, he has an ion exchange HPLC, Menarini, and capillary electrophoresis, also an affinity chromatography, but is not certified according to the NGSP. I have a boronate affinity, Premier, an immunoassay from Roche, Enzymatic assay from Abbott, and I have the TOZO G8. So we have all the different method principles within the European Reference Laboratory. What are the secondary reference labs doing? Well, they work together with manufacturers by sending them samples with assigned values. But this is not a real calibration, it is a harmonization. And we work together with manufacturers to get an NGSP manufacturer certification. And we use all these secondary reference methods to assign values to external quality schemes, like the CAP survey in America. But in Europe, we have different rules. It says that the diagnostic manufacturers must guarantee the traceability of their routine tests to reference methods and materials of higher metrological order. But this is not possible with the NGSP standardization, because that method is not of a higher metrological order. And ISO also demands documentation about how to trace back assigned values. This is also not possible with the NGSP primary reference method. And this is the way how it really should be done. This is the traceability chain. You first have to define what you want to measure. And with HbA1c, we said glucose attached to the internal valine of the beta chain is what we want to measure. Then you have to develop a primary reference method, which we did. But this primary reference method needs to be calibrated with primary calibrators. These primary calibrators consist of almost pure A0 and almost pure HbA1c. And in our lab, we mix these two and we calibrate the primary reference methods with that. But these primary calibrators cannot be used for routine methods. You need to have secondary calibrators. This is made in our lab. The values assigned to these secondary calibrators are done with all the primary reference methods. These secondary calibrators are used to calibrate my secondary reference methods in my lab, but they are also sent to all the major manufacturers worldwide. And they are using the secondary calibrators to assign values to their own calibrator. So eventually you can trace back the patient results to this primary calibrator, and that is very important. This is how the IFCC reference method is working. I will not go in very detail, but what you can see already is that it takes 22 hours before you get one result, and that we are using an enzyme which cuts after the sixth amino acid of the beta chain. We have now 21 labs approved worldwide who are running the IFCC primary reference method. We cannot handle more labs running the primary reference method, but I think 21 labs is quite more than enough. But the real heart of the standardization is the secondary reference material. Every year I invite 100 patients with diabetes and I take blood from 15 of my colleagues. I take in total 250 milliliter in these big bottles. And from that blood we make 10 pools. In every pool there are at least 10 patients. These 10 pools are sent to all the IFCC primary reference labs, so the 21 labs worldwide, but also to the secondary reference methods from the NGSP. And the pools are sent to the manufacturers so that they can use it to assign values to their calibrator. And we use this blood also for the NGSP certification sets and for an IFCC certification sets. So once the blood is drawn in our hospital, my colleague brings this to the other hospital in the Netherlands, to Kaswijkamp's lab. They are very good at processing all the samples, putting them in vials, and send them all over the world. And this is quite a challenge, I can say. For many years, we were not able to get the blood in time to Japan. So there was a lottery every year who of the technicians could bring the samples in the hand luggage to Japan, of course with all the official papers, but we brought it in person to Japan because we had often that it was released too late from customs and then we could not use the blood anymore. But we ended up with different results between the IFCC and the NGSP. If you would report it in the same units, you see that the IFCC method is giving lower results. And not to confuse the doctors and the patients, as a working group, we decided to report now in SI units, so millimole per mole. We have now the master equations between the different standardization models, so you can calculate easily back from NGSP to IFCC and vice versa. We check this master equation every year so that we are sure that there is no trend or shift and that it is stable. And we also have now the uniform reference ranges in SI units, but also in NGSP units. So in summary, there are two key groups driving standardization and quality. One is the NGSP, which is a harmonization, and the goal is to harmonize HbA1c test results so that clinical laboratory results are comparable to those reported in the DCT, where relationship to mean blood glucose and risk for vascular complication have been established. So harmonization, not a calibration, because we don't have any calibrators and we cannot trace back the result of the patients to a calibrator. A more robust and scientifically sound standardization is the IFCC standardization, and the purpose is to standardize test results of all routine HbA1c assays worldwide to the IFCC primary reference measurement procedure so that patient results can be traced back to a primary calibrator. In 2010, there was a consensus statement. And well, the most important thing is that they recognize that the IFCC reference system is the only valid anchor for standardization and that HbA1c should be reported in SI units and derived NGSP units. Unfortunately, this is still not the case in many countries. But there is an impact of changing the units on imprecision. I want to make this clear to you because it's quite important, that because you cannot compare CVs in NGSP units with CVs in SI units, and I will explain you why. So if you have a sample and you analyze it 15 times in NGSP units, and you calculate the CV is 1.9. You do the same, but then in SI units, then all of a sudden you see that the CV is 2.7. How is this possible? Well, this is the reason why. This is a chromatogram of the primary reference method from the NGSP. You can see already that the HbA1c peak is not completely separated from the front peak. So underneath this peak, there's not only HbA1c, but also other substances. And this is really nice reflected in the master equation between the IFCC and the NGSP, because the 23.5 is the unspecificity of the method used in the DST study. Because if you add the 23.5 to these numbers and calculate again the CV, then you see it's exactly the same. So the most important thing you have to remember is you cannot compare CVs in NGSP units with CVs in SI units, because the CVs in NGSP units are falsely low. Well, we also need to talk about precision, because it is as important as standardization. If you have a method and you analyze your sample and it's, for example, 43 millimole per mole, then, and you have a method with an imprecision of 1%, you are still okay. Then it is 42 or 43 or 44. With 2%, you are also still okay. But if you have a CV of your method for 4%, that if you analyze it one time, you can get a result of 40 with a low risk. If you analyze it again, then it might be 47, and then you have diabetes. So that is the impact of imprecision. So you need to have a method with as low as possible CV. So let's talk a little bit about the different HbA1c methods. We have different methodologies based on separation or chemical, and with separation based on different in charge or in structure. HPLC cation exchange, capillary electrophoresis, or with structure affinity chromatography, and with chemical we have the immunoassays and the enzymatic assays. All these methods, they are standardized according to the IFCC standardization, so with the pools which we are sending every year to all the major manufacturers. So people ask me often, what is the best method? Well, the most suitable method depends on the laboratory and clinical needs, because if you have a lab with only 40 samples to analyze per day, there is a different need than when you have 4,000 samples per day. So it is different. But cation exchange and capillary electrophoresis are highly reproducible, and variants can be identified. Affinity methods we use if there is an interference of HB variants, because this method has no interference of HB variants, only when HbF is higher than 50%. And the enzymatic and immunoassays can be performed on general chemistry analysis and have a higher throughput. But I want to say again, HPLC is not the golden standard. Well, in fact, the perfect HbA1c method doesn't exist. All have their advantages and disadvantages. The methods we have in our lab, we have the Premier, Tina Quant, Total G8, and the Abbott Enzymatic, and we have the IFCC primary reference method. In the other lab, we have the Menarini, we have the Premier, we have CBR capillary electrophoresis, and we have the IFCC and NGSP primary reference method. So we have all the methods in the European reference laboratory. Affinity chromatography, well, it measures total glycation. So when glucose is attached to hemoglobin, it will bind to the column. If there is no glucose attached to hemoglobin, it will go through the column. So eventually you will get two peaks, a glycated peak and a non-glycated peak. And these methods we mainly use if there are HB variants present, because whatever is happening in the hemoglobin molecule, it doesn't matter. If glucose is attached, you will analyze it. Then there is ion exchange HPLC. If glucose is attached to hemoglobin, it is just a little bit less positive charge, so the delay due to the negative ions is a little bit less, so it will leave the column a little bit earlier. Capillary electrophoresis. Well, this is a really nice method. You have a really nice separation of all the peaks, and what they do is that they only take the A1C peak and the A0 peak. They are not interested in all the other peaks. So it's quite specific and has no interference. So it's also a very nice method. immunoassays. First, you hemolyze the sample. Then you photometric determination of total hemoglobin. Then you add an excess of anti-HbA1c that binds with HbA1c, and the excess of anti-HbA1c is caught by a polyhapten, and this then there is a turbidimetric determination of antibody polyhapten complex. Well, here you see my colleague. Well, it was quite funny because when I made the first instrument from Rose, it was an Integra, and I was making this picture, and she said, "Oh, that is an unbelievable boring picture. You should do it in a way like they're doing with cars, like with a pin-up girl." I said, "Okay, you are going to be my pin-up girl." But now we have the C5103, and the instruments are not that robust anymore. So, and she gained a little bit of weight, so that's why she's here. It is a secondary reference method. It's also a very simple method. It's a dedicated instrument, so only HbA1c can be measured on this instrument. And it's, well, I would recommend only to use it in commercial labs where you have thousands of samples per day. There's no interference of the common variants. A disadvantage, well, maybe the instrument is quite large, which is a disadvantage, can be a disadvantage. What is really nice is the antibodies they are using are against the last 4 amino acids and glucose attached to the beta valine. And if there is a variant present, you will have a substitution of the amino acid, the 6th amino acid for when it is an S variant, or C variant, also the 6th amino acid. E, the 26th amino acid is a substitution, and for D, the 121. So, but the antibodies are against the last 4 amino acids, so there is no interference whatsoever. Only if there is a substitution in the last 4 amino acids of the beta chain, you will have an interference. And here you see some examples of some very, very rare variants. Then we have the enzymatic method from Abbott. I will not go in detail in the principle of the enzymatic methods. The only thing you have to remember is that they are using an enzyme which cuts after the 2nd amino acid of the beta chain. And this is something you can measure with a coloring agent. It is a very simple method. I really love this instrument because it's so user-friendly. Disadvantage, or maybe it is also quite big, but on this instrument you can also measure other parameters. I would talk a little bit about this paper. I did an evaluation of the Abbott instrument, the C5103 from Rose, and also the TOSO G11, but I will use the results of the Abbott methods. Well, this is sigma metrics. I could also talk and give a presentation about sigma metrics, but I will not do that. In this graph, you see that we have combined bias in this side with CV. I used the results of the Abbott enzymatic from the IFCC monitoring program, 24 samples. 24 samples, the values are assigned with the 21 labs worldwide running the primary reference method. And you see that the Abbott method has hardly any bias. Also, the CV is unbelievably low. And in the whole evaluation, this is this one, it is world-class performance of the Abbott method. Also now it's a secondary reference method from the NGSP. And here you can see that the CV, so the imprecision is, well, I couldn't believe it in the beginning when I was running this method that it was so low and that it was so precise. So I'm very happy with this. Here you see the IFCC certification. Also, it has a gold performance in the IFCC certification. Let's talk a little bit about interference and HB variants. I would say the never-ending story. Well, there are causes of interference of HbA1c. Well, you can have an inappropriate low HbA1c when the turnover of the red blood cells is going faster than normally. Normally, a red blood cell lives 100 to 120 days. So then you can have an inappropriate low HbA1c, like with certain hemoglobinopathies, or when you have a recent blood transfusion or acute blood loss. But there's one thing you need to take into account. Are we talking about an analytical error, which might be the case if you have an HB variant, or is it an interpretation problem? And most of the time, when you're talking about an interpretation problem, it has to do with the turnover of the red blood cells. This was published last year in Clinical Chemistry, and we had a patient with autoantibodies. So also the turnover of the red blood cells was much faster, and therefore the HbA1c didn't correlate well with the mean blood glucose. So it's estimated that 7% of the world population carry genes for hemoglobinopathy and thalassemia. Hemoglobinopathies is an abnormal structure of the global chains. So you have the heterozygous, but also the homozygous. What I want to say is never analyze or measure HbA1c when a patient has a homozygous variant, because it has to do again with the turnover of the red blood cells. There's also a compound of variants. Thalassemia is a quantitative deficiency in the production of hemoglobin, alpha thalassemia, beta thalassemia, and so on. And there are now more than 1,500 structural HB variants known. So if you have a mother and a father, and they are a carrier of a gene, the hemoglobin variant, they have 25% that they will get a child with a HB major. And this can be avoided if you use the information from a chromatogram from a HPLC. If you see if the patient is a carrier of a variant, and you are using that for genetic counseling to avoid babies born with HBA major. That is, in my opinion, the only advantage by if you see an HB variant in your HPLC. If you don't do anything with the information, no genetic counseling to avoid this, then it has no added value to know if there is a variant present or not. The only thing you have to know then is, will that variant interfere with your method or not? So common heterozygous hemoglobin variants and hereditary persistence of hemoglobin F, they are usually clinically silent, and they are widely spread all over the world. And the red cell lifespan is reported to be in a normal range for most HB variants. Only talking about heterozygous hemoglobin variants, not homozygous. And the interference varies with a specific method. Let's have a closer look at HPLC and HB variants. This is the normal situation. You have an HbA1c peak and an A0 peak, and you can calculate HbA1c. If the variant, the non-glycated variant, is separated from the A0, and the glycated fraction from the variant is separated from the A1c, you can have a very reliable HbA1c, no problem. But if there is an overlap anywhere, the results are not reliable. But the biggest problem is that if you have a variant which gives almost a normal chromatogram, and then you get a falsely low HbA1c result. Here you see an example of mitoso. This chromatogram looks almost normal, but this is a glycated E peak. And if the instrument doesn't recognize this very small peak, you will get a falsely low HbA1c. Fortunately, Tozo recognized now this small peak, and so they can correct for it, and now it gives a correct HbA1c result. But there was a problem. My colleague, Randy Little, she did a big study, and she found out that all the Tozos were giving falsely low results with the common variants after a software update of their instrument, which was not very good. Fortunately, they made an update of the software, and there is now not an interference anymore. But unfortunately, this has to go to FDA approval. So this new software update is still not available in America. So you have to be very careful with HB variants and when you are using a total instrument. This is the results of an external quality scheme from England. The assigned value is 35.3. The values were assigned with our reference method in our lab. And you can see that the ion exchange HPLC were giving a falsely high result because there was a variant present, a very rare variant. Most likely you couldn't see it in the chromatogram. It was hidden behind a normal chromatogram. All the immunoassays, they were performing well. I made this flow chart to show the complexity of HbA1c measurement with cation exchange HPLC in the presence of HB variants. You have to check every chromatogram, manually or by software. In our lab, we do it by software. We have put all the knowledge I have in my head to interpret the chromatogram into the software. If the chromatogram is normal, you can report HbA1c. But I have also shown you that some rare variants are underneath, and then you are reporting it falsely. If the chromatogram looks like a normal, a common variant, you can go to the website of the NGSP. And if the NGSP website says that that method you are using has no interference, you can report it. But does it has an interference, you should use another method like affinity chromatography. If the chromatogram is not like a normal or common variant, and is it heterozygous, then you can also use affinity chromatography. And as I explained already to you, if it is homozygous, don't use HbA1c, don't report HbA1c. HbA1c and HbF. Well, HbF does not glycate as fast as HbA. And HbF consists 2 alpha to gamma chains, which is a problem for immunoassays because and enzymatic assays, because they are against the beta chain, antibodies against the beta chain. If HbF is included in the measurement of total hemoglobin, the HbA1c will be falsely low. HbA1c methods where HbF is included in total hemoglobin are immunoassays, enzymatic assays, and affinity separation like point of care. And HbA1c methods where HbF can be separated from total hemoglobin, ion exchange, and capillary electrophoresis. Is it a real problem? Well, most of these methods, they interfere if HbF is higher than 7%. HbF might be higher with a beta thalassemia, but never higher than 7%. You only have higher HbF when there is when you are talking about hereditary persistent fetal hemoglobin. Yes, I have rehearsed this, but anyway, so I don't think this is a real problem with all these immunoassays and enzymatic assays. So HbA1c variants, the questions which you need to answer. Are you only interested in a reliable HbA1c result, or do you also want information about a possible HB variant? And if yes, what do you do with the information? Do you use it for, do you use the information for genetic counseling? And you cannot make a diagnosis only based on a peak in a chromatogram. The whole picture should be taken into account for a diagnosis. If you have a sickle cell test, the HBS and the sickle cell test, you have 100% certainty. If you have a C or an E variant and you know the ethnic origin, you have more than 90% certainty. But to be 100% sure, there should be a confirmation of the HB variant on DNA level. So let's have a closer look at the analytical performance with external quality scheme. I will show the results of the colleague of American pathology survey and our own A1c survey, which we organize and now in our ERL lab. Well, sorry for all the numbers, but I will walk you through. Here you see the 5 different samples. The values assigned are done with, I think now in total, 7 secondary reference methods from the NGSP, also our lab, so the values are accurate. Here you see all the different methods and the number of labs using that specific method. The mean of all these labs using that method and the mean bias and the interlab CV. What you can see here from the Abbott method that it is performing really, really well. Because if you have an interlab CV of 1.4 or even 1.1, then you are doing really a good job. Also, the point of care instruments from Abbott are performing quite well if you compare it with some other laboratory-based methods. But I would like to talk with you also about the A1c, which we organize in our hospital. It was published in Clinical Chemistry 2018. How it is organized, this is a trial of 2019. Well, on a Sunday, I draw blood from 15 donors, diabetes persons. I know them all by name. And every time when I ask them, can you please give me some blood, which I need, they always come. And why is that? Because I have a very good relationship with all these donors. I know them by name, and every year when I see them, it's quite a kind of reunion. So anyway, and we draw blood from non-diabetics, so we have 2 samples. We send these samples to all the EQA organizers in the different countries, and they distribute all the samples to all the labs within their country. So we have now 3,038 labs participating with fresh whole blood, because there are also some countries who are not able to distribute the samples within 1 week, because you have to analyze the samples, the fresh samples, within 1 week. That is also why I draw the blood on Sunday. So we have 1 day, we win 1 day with a post. And there are 1,537 labs participating with lyophilized samples. The values assigned to these 2 samples are done with the IFCC primary reference method and with the IFCC secondary reference method, and also from the NGSP. Here you see the results, 2 samples and the target value. Again, all the different methods and the labs using that specific method, the mean and the bias and the interlab CV. Again, you can see that the Abbott method, the Enzymatic method, is performing quite well. I think this is still also some immunoassays involved. And to be honest, I was not a fan of the immunoassay of Abbott because it was absolutely not performing well. But fortunately, they have now the Enzymatic method, and you can see that it is performing as the best method when we are talking about imprecision compared with all the different methods. But also the Affinity point of care instrument is performing quite well. I'm a little bit concerned about the difference in bias between the enzymatic method and the point of care, but this is something which need to be fixed in my opinion. What you can also do with the results in Sigma metrics, you can show the performance per country. Like here, so 2 sigma is the limit. You have to have sigma 2 or higher. So we see that there are still some countries which are not performing good enough, at least the mean. You see the same with the lyophilized samples, but you can also show the results performance per manufacturer. So the different manufacturers. You see, some are performing really, really well, but also some are not doing well at all. This is a very good information for the manufacturers, and also to show them and to encourage them to improve their methods or take it from the market. and the same with lyophilized samples. But you can also show the results per method, different instruments, and so on. Yeah, there is still something to gain, like the CBI is performing quite well. Some Roche methods are not performing well. But for a manufacturer, this is very valuable information. Okay, conclusions. HPLC is not the gold standard for HbA1c. This came from the DST study, but that is a very old study, and now the routine methods are, most of them are equal performing. Some HPLC have significant problems with some HB variants, especially when HB variant is present and the chromatogram is normal. A chromatogram can give additional information about possible HB variant, but diagnosis of hemoglobinopathy is not as simple as it looks. Information of presence of an HB variant should be used for choosing the right HbA1c method and, if applicable, for genetic counseling. The Abbott enzymatic method has no interference of common variants. I want to thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Dr. Lenters-Westra, for that informative presentation. And we will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. So let's take a look. We already have some great questions coming in. So our first question from our audience member is, does a NGSP certification or IFCC certification guarantee a good performance of an HbA1c instrument?
Well, to be honest, no. It gives information to the manufacturer, but it doesn't say anything about the performance in routine labs. Because an NGSP certification and IFCC certification is done under ideal circumstances, and most of the time with just one instrument, with one lot number, and with one calibration. So if you really want to know how the performance is of a routine method, you have to look at the external quality scheme. They will give you a real reliable results of the analytical performance of a routine method.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Lenters-Westra, what is your opinion on the best HbA1c method?
Oh, this is a question I often get. Well, to be honest, I cannot say, because it depends on the lab. It depends on how many samples you have. If you have just well, 30 or 40 or maybe 100 samples per day, then it's very easy to run them on an HPLC. You have time enough to check all the chromatograms, no problem. But if you have more than 1,000 samples per day, then it's almost impossible to do it with HPLC. So then an immunoassay or an enzymatic assay is the best choice. Also, it is not only about the method. It is also not only about the analytical performance, but it is also about the support of the manufacturer. Because you can have the best performing method, but if something is broken and the manufacturer or the distributor is not going to help you, that is also a big problem. So there are many factors you have to take into account, and I would also recommend to look at the external quality schemes, how the method is performing.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank our audience members for these great questions coming in. Now, do you think that one day we will report one unit, like an MMOL, MOL, in the whole world?
Oh, that is my dream. That is really my dream, because when we started with the IFCC working group for the standardization of HbA1c, the goal was to have one reporting unit eventually. But after the consensus statement was signed, it appears that every country is reporting in the way they wanted to do it. But I am not happy with this at all, because it is confusing. Also for manufacturers, but also for myself. If I have to write an article, then I have to also write down in SI units, but also in NGSP units. And I know that many medical doctors don't want to change the units because they think it's very confusing for themselves, but also for the patients. But if we in Europe are able to make this change, then you should also be able in other countries to make this change to millimole per mole. So yes, most of the countries in Europe, they are now reporting in millimole per mole. And other countries in Asia, like India and other countries, are now considering also to make this change. And eventually, I hope that one day we will have one reporting unit, which is SI units in millimole per mole.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Lantjes-Westra, we have time for one more question. Is it necessary to see if there is an HB variant present?
Well, I've told you already in the presentation that it depends on what you do with the information. If you see that there is a variant present and you use this information for genetic counseling so that there will be no babies born with HB major, then yes, it really has an added value. But the problem is that many doctors don't do any genetic counseling and they don't use this information. So if you don't do anything with the information, it has no real added value. You only need to know that if that HB variant has an interference with the method you are using. But most of the routine methods nowadays have no interference of the common variants. And if you are not completely sure if your method has an interference, I would recommend to go to the NGSP website. They have a nice overview with all the different methods and if there is an interference or not.
Dr. Lantjes-Westra, thank you so much for your time today and for your important research. Would you like to provide any closing remarks before we go?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Abbott for the invitation to give this webinar. Even if I don't like to give webinars so much, I like to give live presentations to have an interaction with all of you. But I think manufacturers have made a big improvement in the analytical performance of their methods. So I am really, really happy with this. Also, I want to encourage all of you who are listening to the webinar, if you have great ideas for big studies or whatever, please do not hesitate to contact me. Maybe we can set up something and which is in the benefit of the patients, because that is the only thing what is important. Me as a researcher, I am not important. Also, the manufacturers are not that important. It is all about the patient, and that is where we are doing this great work for.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Lantjes-Westra. It was great to have you here. And we'd also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Abbott Diagnostics, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I want to remind the audience, thank you for joining us today and for your interesting questions and questions we didn't have time for today, and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. And this webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, stay healthy. Bye-bye for now.